The arrow left Silas Garrett's bow in a howling gust that bent the pines nearly horizontal. 50 yards away through curtains of snow, the mule deer buck stood broadside, unaware that an impossible shot was already in flight. When the arrow struck exactly where Silas had aimed, despite wind that should have carried it 3 feet off target, the man watching from the cabin window finally understood that what he had dismissed as frontier superstition was actually frontier engineering. What Silas had discovered over 18 months of obsessive experimentation would change how mountain men hunted in winter storms across the northern Rockies, and the technique would mean the difference between starvation and survival for dozens of families over the next 2 decades. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you've ever tried shooting anything in serious wind, drop a comment about how impossible it feels. If stories about forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The Wyoming Territory winter of 1840 presented mountain men with the same problem their predecessors had faced for generations. When storms rolled through the high country and temperatures dropped below zero, rifles became unreliable. Black powder absorbed moisture from snow and fog, creating misfires that left hunters staring at game they couldn't kill. Flints refused to spark in bitter cold. Metal components contracted and jammed. Men who depended entirely on firearms for winter meat often went hungry during the worst weather, waiting for calm days that sometimes didn't come for weeks. Silas Garrett understood this reality better than most. He had spent 4 winters trapping beaver in the mountains east of the Continental Divide, working territory along the tributaries that fed the North Platte River. His partner, Nathaniel Hutchins, had been with him for all 4 seasons. They were competent, careful, and successful by the standards of men who chose that life. Their camp was well maintained. Their trap lines were productive. They survived where others failed because they paid attention to details and didn't take unnecessary risks. Both men carried bows as backup weapons, a common practice among trappers who had learned that arrows didn't care about moisture or cold. The bows they used were simple affairs. Single pieces of seasoned wood, usually ash or hickory, shaped with a draw knife until they bent smoothly under tension. The strings were twisted sinew, waterproofed with rendered fat. Draw weights ranged from 40 to 60 pounds, enough to drive an arrow through a deer at reasonable distance, but light enough to pull repeatedly without exhausting the shooter. Their arrows followed patterns that had changed little in centuries. Straight shafts cut from young birch or cedar, stripped and sanded smooth, roughly 30 inches long. 3 feathers fletched onto each shaft using pine resin and sinew thread. The fletchings were positioned straight along the shaft, parallel to its length, trimmed to about 5 inches long and half an inch high. Stone or iron points were fitted to the front, secured with more sinew and resin. A notch cut into the rear allowed the arrow to sit on the bowstring. The entire construction took perhaps 2 hours per arrow for an experienced craftsman. These arrows worked adequately in calm conditions. At 20 yards, a decent archer could hit a deer's vital area reliably. At 30 yards, accuracy decreased but remained acceptable. Beyond 40 yards, even skilled shooters struggled with consistency. The arrows simply weren't precise enough for longer distances, and most hunters accepted this limitation as the natural order of things. Wind changed everything. Even moderate breezes pushed arrows off course. Strong gusts made accuracy impossible beyond close range. During winter storms with sustained winds above 20 miles per hour, standard arrows became nearly useless for hunting. The lightweight shafts and high-profile fletchings caught the wind like sails, carrying arrows far from their intended paths. Hunters learned to wait for calm weather or accept very low success rates when conditions were poor. Silas and Nathaniel had discussed this limitation many times during their partnership. They had both missed shots they should have made because wind deflected their arrows. They had both watched wounded game escape because follow-up shots in gusty conditions proved impossible. But like every other mountain man, they viewed wind as an unchangeable obstacle. You worked around it. You got closer to your target. You waited for better conditions. The idea that arrows themselves could be engineered to fly true in wind simply hadn't occurred to either man. That assumption would cost Nathaniel his life. January 14, 1841, began as an ordinary winter morning. Silas woke before dawn to check their trap lines on the northern circuit, while Nathaniel planned to work the southern route. The sky was overcast but calm, temperatures hovering near zero. They ate a quick breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried venison, gathered their gear, and separated at the edge of camp just after sunrise. By mid-morning, conditions had changed. Clouds thickened and lowered. Wind began gusting from the northwest, carrying the smell of incoming snow. Silas, 3 miles from camp, recognized the signs of a developing storm and turned back immediately. He assumed Nathaniel would do the same. Mountain men survived by respecting weather, not fighting it. Nathaniel had made a different calculation. On his southern circuit, he had spotted fresh deer tracks near a frozen creek, where a natural spring kept a small section of water open year-round. Deer congregated there during harsh weather. He knew the storm was building, but he also knew their meat supplies were running low. 1 deer would feed them for 2 weeks. The opportunity seemed worth the risk. He found the deer exactly where he expected them. 4 does and a young buck, standing in willows 30 yards from the creek. The wind was already gusting hard enough to bend saplings. Nathaniel nocked an arrow, drew, aimed carefully at the nearest doe, and released. The arrow flew true for the first 20 yards, then a gust caught it and pushed it 2 feet left. The shaft passed harmlessly through empty air. The deer bolted. Nathaniel tracked them for half a mile before finding them again, this time at 40 yards in more open terrain. He aimed higher and farther right, trying to compensate for wind. The arrow flew wild, pushed by a gust he hadn't anticipated. Another miss. The deer ran again. He spent the next 3 hours pursuing them through worsening conditions. The storm intensified. Snow began falling heavily. Visibility dropped. Each time he got within range, the wind defeated him. He tried compensating more. He tried shooting during lulls between gusts. He tried getting closer. Nothing worked. Standard arrows in storm winds simply couldn't fly straight. By early afternoon, Nathaniel had exhausted 8 of his 12 arrows. The deer were long gone. He was 5 miles from camp in a full blizzard. He started back, but the combination of deep snow, poor visibility, and physical exhaustion from hours of stalking slowed him drastically. The temperature dropped as darkness approached. Silas grew concerned when Nathaniel hadn't returned by nightfall. He spent the next day searching but couldn't find tracks in the heavy new snow. On the 3rd day, following a hunch about Nathaniel's likely route, he found his partner's body 2 miles south of camp. Nathaniel had died from exposure, probably during the first night. His bow was still strapped across his back. His quiver held 4 unused arrows. The snow around him showed no signs of injury or attack. He had simply run out of time and warmth. Silas buried him on a ridge overlooking the valley, where they had trapped together for 4 winters. Silas spent the week after Nathaniel's burial alone in their cabin, processing what had happened. He inventoried their supplies, maintained their equipment, and kept the fire going, but his mind remained fixed on a single question: why had Nathaniel died? The obvious answer was exposure to cold during a blizzard. But that answer felt incomplete. Nathaniel had survived worse storms. He knew how to navigate in poor conditions. He carried fire-starting materials and emergency supplies. The real answer, Silas realized, was failure. Nathaniel had died because he couldn't kill a deer when he needed to. He had failed not from lack of skill or courage, but because his arrows couldn't fly straight in wind. That mechanical limitation had kept him out in dangerous conditions too long, and the delay had killed him. Most mountain men would have accepted this as tragic but inevitable. Weather killed people. Equipment had limitations. A man did his best and hoped luck favored him. Silas couldn't accept that conclusion. The problem felt solvable. Wind affected arrows in predictable ways. If you understood those effects, perhaps you could design arrows that resisted them. He began paying attention to how wind moved different objects. Light leaves tumbled chaotically. Heavy branches swayed but held their position. Birds adjusted their flight constantly, angling into gusts, compensating with wing movements. Snow fell in complex patterns, sometimes straight down, sometimes horizontal, sometimes spiraling. Everything responded to wind differently based on its weight, shape, and surface area. In late January, Silas visited Jacob Mercer's camp 8 miles west. Jacob was a taciturn man who had trapped the region for 6 winters. Silas asked him about hunting and wind. Jacob shrugged. You waited for calm weather, or you got close enough that wind didn't matter. Had he ever made a successful shot beyond 30 yards in strong wind? Never reliably. Did he know anyone who could? Not with arrows. Rifles could punch through wind better because bullets were heavier and faster, but even rifles lost accuracy in storms. In early February, Silas traveled to Daniel Croft's camp 12 miles north. Daniel was older, more experienced, and more talkative than Jacob. He had spent 15 years in the mountains and had strong opinions about equipment. Silas asked similar questions. Daniel's answers matched Jacob's. Wind was an unsolvable problem for archery. You accepted the limitation and adjusted your hunting strategy accordingly. Some years, when storms persisted through winter, you went hungry. That was mountain life. Silas visited one more camp before the month ended. The trapper there, a French-Canadian whose name Silas never learned properly, told stories about indigenous hunters who could shoot accurately in conditions that defeated white trappers. But he attributed their success to supernatural factors, not technique or equipment design. The conversation provided no useful information. By late February, Silas had confirmed what he suspected. Every experienced hunter agreed that wind made long-range archery impossible. None had tried to solve the problem through engineering. They simply accepted it as unchangeable reality. Silas decided he would spend the spring and summer trying to change that reality. If he failed, he would lose a season's worth of trapping income. If he succeeded, he might prevent other men from dying the way Nathaniel had. Spring arrived in late March with warming temperatures and melting snow. Silas established a testing ground on flat terrain half a mile from his cabin. He paced off distances and marked them with stakes: 20 yards, 30 yards, 40 yards, 50 yards. He set up targets using bundles of grass wrapped in canvas and mounted on wooden frames. Then he began systematic experimentation. The first step was understanding failure. Silas took a standard arrow from his existing supply and examined every component. The shaft was birch, roughly 7/16 of an inch in diameter, 31 inches long. The 3 fletchings were turkey feathers, trimmed to 5 inches in length and half an inch high, glued and tied parallel to the shaft. The stone point weighed approximately half an ounce. The entire arrow weighed just under 2 ounces. He shot this arrow repeatedly in various wind conditions, watching carefully how it flew. In calm air, it traveled straight and struck close to his aiming point at 30 yards. When wind gusted from the side, the arrow drifted noticeably. At 40 yards in 10-mile-per-hour crosswinds, the drift reached 18 to 24 inches. At 50 yards, the arrow became nearly useless, sometimes missing targets by 3 feet or more. Silas began testing variables. He built arrows with different shaft woods. Cedar was lighter than birch and drifted even worse. Ash was heavier and drifted slightly less, but flew slower and dropped more over distance. He tried thicker shafts and thinner shafts. Thicker shafts were heavier and more stable, but required stronger bows to shoot effectively. Thinner shafts were too flexible and wobbled erratically. He experimented with fletching height. Shorter fletchings provided less wind resistance, but also less stability. The arrow wobbled more in flight. Taller fletchings increased stability, but caught more wind and amplified drift. He tried 2-feather configurations and 4-feather configurations. 2 feathers provided insufficient stability. 4 feathers created too much drag and wind catch. He tested fletching length. 3-inch fletchings were too short to stabilize the arrow properly. 7-inch fletchings were too long and created excessive drag. 5 to 6 inches seemed optimal, but even optimal standard fletchings didn't solve the wind problem. He adjusted arrow weight by changing point mass. Heavier points made arrows more stable, but caused them to drop more over distance, requiring higher aiming angles that introduced new accuracy problems. Lighter points allowed flatter trajectories but increased wind sensitivity. By late April, Silas had built and tested 43 different arrow designs. He had filled a notebook with observations about each configuration's performance. Every design was a compromise. More stability meant more wind catch. Less wind catch meant less stability. Heavier arrows resisted wind better but flew shorter distances. Lighter arrows flew farther but drifted worse. None of his modifications had produced arrows that flew significantly better than standard designs in windy conditions. He had learned what didn't work, but he hadn't discovered what did work. One evening in early May, sitting outside his cabin watching the sunset, Silas noticed an eagle feather drifting down from the sky above. The wind was gusting fairly strong, but the feather didn't tumble, chaotically like he expected. It spun as it fell, rotating smoothly around its central axis, maintaining a steady downward path despite the wind. Silas picked up the eagle feather and examined it closely. The vane curved slightly along its length, not dramatically, but enough to create an asymmetrical surface. When the feather fell, air pressure against that curved surface caused rotation. The spinning motion created stability. The feather didn't tumble because it was constantly correcting itself through gyroscopic effect, the same principle that kept spinning tops upright. He looked at his standard arrows. The fletchings were mounted perfectly straight, parallel to the shaft. They stabilized the arrow through air resistance, like tail fins on a weather vane. But they didn't cause the arrow to spin. The arrow flew straight, or it didn't, depending entirely on whether wind pushed evenly on all surfaces. What if fletchings were mounted at an angle? What if they forced the arrow to spin? During flight, Silas selected a straight birch shaft and 3 turkey feathers. Instead of mounting the fletchings parallel to the shaft, he angled them. He placed each feather so its leading edge sat against the shaft, but its trailing edge was offset by roughly 1/8 of an inch. When viewed from the rear, the 3 fletchings formed a pattern like a windmill or a rifle's spiral grooves. The construction required precise work. The feathers had to be angled identically, or the arrow would spin unevenly and tumble. He used a straight edge and careful measurements to position each fletching at the same angle. He secured them with pine resin heated until it became workable, then reinforced the attachment with fine sinew thread. The entire process took 4 hours for a single arrow. The next morning, Silas tested the spiral-fletched arrow. He shot it in calm conditions first. The arrow flew true and struck the 30-yard target near center. He could see it spinning during flight, rotating rapidly around its length. The spin didn't seem to affect accuracy in calm air. Then he waited for wind. By afternoon, gusts were blowing steadily from the west at 15 to 20 miles per hour. Silas shot his standard arrows first to establish baseline performance. At 40 yards in the crosswind, they drifted 18 to 30 inches off target, consistent with his previous observations. He knocked the spiral-fletched arrow, drew, aimed at the same target, and released. The arrow spun rapidly as it flew. The wind pushed against it, but instead of drifting steadily off course like standard arrows, it maintained its trajectory. The spin kept it oriented properly. When wind pushed from one side, the rotation brought different arrow surfaces into the airflow, distributing the force evenly rather than allowing cumulative drift. The arrow struck 6 inches left of center. In conditions that pushed standard arrows more than 2 feet off target, the spiral-fletched design had drifted only 6 inches. Silas stood motionless for several seconds, processing what he had just witnessed. The principle worked. Spin stabilization dramatically reduced wind drift. The effect wasn't complete elimination of wind influence, but it was revolutionary improvement over standard designs. He spent the next 2 weeks building 11 more spiral-fletched arrows, measuring and angling each fletching with obsessive precision. Every arrow had to be identical, or the system wouldn't work reliably. By late May, Silas had 12 spiral-fletched arrows that performed consistently in wind. But testing revealed a new problem. His existing bow didn't optimize the arrow's potential. The bow he had used for 4 years was adequate for standard arrows, but the spiral-fletched design required different energy transfer characteristics to achieve maximum stability. The issue was subtle but measurable. When Silas shot his new arrows from his old bow, they spun reliably and resisted wind drift, but their grouping at 50 yards remained inconsistent. Some arrows struck within 8 inches of his aiming point, others drifted 12 to 15 inches. The variation suggested the bow wasn't releasing energy evenly across all shots. He began studying bow mechanics with the same systematic approach he had applied to arrows. A bow was fundamentally a spring that stored energy when drawn and released that energy into the arrow when the string was loosed. The efficiency of energy transfer depended on multiple factors: the wood's flexibility and strength, the bow's length and curve, the balance between upper and lower limbs, the weight of the draw relative to arrow mass. Silas's current bow was ash, 62 inches long, with a draw weight of approximately 55 pounds. It had served him well for years, but it hadn't been built with precision. The upper limb was slightly stiffer than the lower limb, creating uneven energy release. The tillering, the process of shaping limbs to bend symmetrically, was adequate but not perfect. He decided to build a new bow specifically matched to his spiral arrows. The first attempt used hickory, a dense wood known for strength and elasticity. He shaped it carefully, spending 3 days with draw knife and scraper, checking the curve constantly. The result was beautiful, but when he tested it in cold water to simulate winter temperatures, the wood developed small stress cracks. Hickory performed well in moderate temperatures, but became brittle in extreme cold. The second attempt used Osage orange, a wood prized by some indigenous bowayers for its combination of strength, flexibility, and durability. Silas had acquired a piece of seasoned Osage orange from a trader 2 years earlier. The wood was dense, golden orange in color, and notoriously difficult to work. He spent 5 days shaping it, removing material gradually, testing the bend repeatedly. The finished bow was 64 inches long, with a draw weight of 58 pounds. The tillering was nearly perfect. Both limbs bent in smooth, even arcs. The string, made from twisted sinew and waterproofed with beeswax, sat centered when the bow was braced. Silas carved a slight shelf into the grip area where the arrow would rest, ensuring consistent arrow position for every shot. Testing revealed dramatic improvement. The Osage orange bow released energy more efficiently and consistently than his old ash bow. When combined with spiral-fletched arrows, the system produced 50-yard groupings that clustered within 6 to 8 inches, even in moderate wind. In calm conditions, all 12 arrows could be placed within a circle the size of a dinner plate at 50 yards. Silas now had both components of a solution. Engineered arrows that resisted wind drift through spin stabilization, a precision bow that delivered consistent energy to those arrows. September 1841 brought Silas back to civilization for the first time since Nathaniel's death. He rode into the trading post settlement on the North Platte River with his summer's work packed carefully in leather cases. He had neglected trapping entirely, focusing instead on perfecting his arrow and bow system. His income for the year would be minimal, but he believed the innovation was worth the sacrifice. The trading post was operated by Henry Wade, a former trapper who had recognized that supplying mountain men was more profitable and less dangerous than being one. His establishment served as general store, tavern, and informal gathering place for trappers working the region. On the September afternoon when Silas arrived, 7 other mountain men were present, drinking whiskey and trading stories. Silas waited until evening, when most men had gathered around the fire outside Wade's building, before mentioning his discovery. He described the problem first. Standard arrows couldn't fly accurately in wind. This limitation made winter hunting unreliable and had contributed to Nathaniel's death. Several men nodded. They all knew the problem. Then Silas explained his solution: arrows with angled fletchings that caused the shaft to spin during flight. The spin created gyroscopic stability that resisted wind drift. Combined with a precision-built bow, the system allowed accurate shooting at 50 yards, even in conditions that made standard archery impossible. Jacob Mercer, who trapped territory west of Silas's range, responded first. He was a blunt man who didn't waste words on politeness. Arrows were arrows, he said. Wind was wind. If you needed meat, You got close enough that wind didn't matter. Spinning arrows sounded like superstitious nonsense, the kind of magical thinking that got men killed when they trusted luck over skill. Daniel Croft was more diplomatic but equally skeptical. He had 15 years of mountain experience and had seen many supposed innovations that proved worthless under real conditions. He acknowledged that Silas was sincere and probably believed his claims, but belief didn't make something true. He would need to see consistent proof before accepting that spiral fletchings actually worked better than traditional designs. Two younger trappers asked questions about construction techniques, curious but unconvinced. How much time did each arrow require? How did you measure the fletching angle precisely? Where did you get Osage orange wood? Their questions focused on practical difficulties rather than theoretical possibility. Henry Wade listened carefully, but said little. As a businessman, he was interested in anything that might create new demand for supplies. If Silas's arrows actually worked, trappers would want materials to build them. But Wade had also seen many men arrive at his post, convinced they had discovered revolutionary techniques that proved ordinary under scrutiny. The conversation continued for another hour, but reached no conclusions. Most men remained politely skeptical. Jacob Mercer remained openly dismissive. No one asked Silas to teach them his method. No one offered to trade for his specialized arrows. Silas purchased winter supplies, loaded them onto his pack horse, and returned to the mountains the next morning. He felt no anger at the skepticism. Men believed what they saw, not what they heard. Winter would provide opportunities for demonstration. December 1841 brought the worst winter storm Silas had experienced in 5 years of mountain life. The blizzard arrived on the 7th and continued with brief interruptions for 8 days. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. Wind gusts exceeded 40 miles per hour. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel exhausting and dangerous. On the morning of December 15th, during a brief lull between storm fronts, Jacob Mercer arrived at Silas's cabin. He looked gaunt and moved with the deliberate care of a man conserving energy. His family was facing starvation. He had a wife and 2 young children in his cabin 12 miles west. Their food supplies were nearly exhausted. He had attempted hunting multiple times during the previous week, but had failed to kill anything. Wind made shooting impossible with his standard equipment. Jacob had come to ask for help. The request clearly humbled him. He was a proud man who valued self-sufficiency. Asking for assistance, especially from someone he had mocked 3 months earlier, represented desperation. Silas agreed immediately. They loaded packs with rope and knives for field dressing game, gathered Silas's bow and spiral-fletched arrows, and set out into deteriorating weather. The storm was building again. Within 2 hours of leaving Silas's cabin, snow was falling heavily, and wind was gusting strong enough to make conversation difficult. They found deer tracks near a creek bottom where thermal springs kept water open year-round. Following the tracks through deep snow took another hour. They located the small herd, 4 does and a buck, in a willow thicket roughly 60 yards from their position. The wind was blowing directly across the shooting lane, gusting between 25 and 35 miles per hour based on how it bent the vegetation. Jacob looked at Silas with obvious doubt. The conditions were impossible for archery by any standard either man had known. But Silas moved forward calmly, positioning himself at a clear shooting lane approximately 50 yards from the nearest deer, a mature doe standing broadside. He knocked one of his spiral-fletched arrows, drew the Osage orange bow to full anchor, and paused. The wind gusted hard enough to make him lean slightly for balance. Snow swirled between him and the target. Through it all, he could see the doe clearly, unaware of danger, head down feeding on exposed bark. Silas aimed higher and farther right than the deer's actual position, compensating for distance and wind. He waited for a momentary reduction in gust intensity, felt the timing arrive, and released. The arrow spun visibly as it flew, rotating rapidly around its shaft. Wind pushed against it, but the spin distributed the force evenly. The trajectory held true. The arrow struck the doe precisely behind the shoulder, penetrating both lungs. The animal ran 20 yards and collapsed. the other deer scattered into heavy timber. Jacob stood motionless, staring at where the doe had fallen. Then he turned to Silas and said 3 words that would change how mountain men hunted across the northern Rockies for the next 2 decades. "Teach me that." Silas and Jacob spent the rest of that day processing the deer and hauling meat back to Jacob's cabin. Jacob's wife, Margaret, wept when she saw the venison. The children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, stared at the meat with hunger that made Silas uncomfortable. Jacob's family had been closer to disaster than Silas had realized. Over the next 3 days, while storms continued to batter the mountains, Silas stayed at Jacob's cabin and taught him the complete system. He explained the physics of spin stabilization, demonstrating with a wooden spindle how rotation created directional stability. He showed Jacob how to measure and mark fletching angles precisely, using a straight edge and careful observation to ensure all 3 feathers were positioned identically. He described wood selection for both arrows and bows, explaining why certain species performed better in extreme cold. Jacob was an attentive student. He asked detailed questions about construction techniques and took notes using charcoal on scraped bark. By the time Silas returned to his own cabin, Jacob understood the principles well enough to begin building his own spiral-fletched arrows. Word spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. When Jacob visited Henry Wade's trading post in January 1842, he told the story of the December hunt. Other trappers listened with new interest. The man who had mocked Silas's innovation 3 months earlier was now its most credible advocate. If Jacob Mercer said spiral-fletched arrows worked, men believed him. Spring brought visitors to Silas's cabin. 3 trappers arrived in April, asking to learn the technique. Silas taught them freely, spending days demonstrating construction methods and explaining the physics behind the innovation. In May, 2 more trappers came. In June, Daniel Croft arrived, apologizing for his earlier skepticism and requesting detailed instruction. Daniel was an experienced craftsman and a quick learner. Within 2 weeks, he had built a matched set of arrows and a precision bow. His testing confirmed everything Silas had claimed. Daniel returned to his territory and shared the knowledge with trappers in his region. The technique spread organically, passed from man to man through demonstration and teaching. By winter 1842, at least 15 trappers were using spiral-fletched arrows. Henry Wade began stocking supplies specifically for their Fime-Ses-Bring construction. Turkey feathers, which had always been available, now sold in larger quantities. Osage orange wood, previously a specialty item, became a regular stock item. Wade even began selling pre-cut arrow shafts to exact specifications, saving builders time and ensuring consistency. The innovation acquired several names. Some men called them Garrett arrows after Silas. Others referred to spiral fletch or storm arrows. A few trappers who had learned the technique from indigenous peoples noted that some tribes had used similar designs for generations, though their specific construction methods differed from Silas's approach. Winter 1842 through spring 1843 brought validation through survival. Multiple families endured harsh conditions successfully because reliable winter hunting was now possible. Men who previously would have faced starvation during extended storms could hunt effectively, even in conditions that had once made archery useless. Henry Wade estimated that the innovation saved at least 8 lives that winter through improved food security. Silas continued trapping through 1847, working the same territory where he and Nathaniel had partnered years earlier. The innovation that had emerged from tragedy became simply part of his routine. He hunted with spiral-fletched arrows in all conditions and taught the technique to anyone who asked. He never attempted to profit from the discovery or claim exclusive knowledge. The mountains had nearly killed him. The system he developed had allowed him to survive. Sharing it seemed natural. In 1848, at age 42, Silas left the mountains permanently. He had saved money during his trapping years and purchased a small homestead in western Wyoming territory near the Oregon Trail. He married Margaret Hanson, a widow traveling west with a wagon train, and they established a modest ranch raising horses for immigrants heading to Oregon and California. Silas rarely spoke about his years as a mountain man. To his wife and the children they raised, he was simply a rancher who had once trapped beaver. His innovation lived on without him, spreading through communities of hunters, trappers, and eventually settlers who moved into the mountain regions during the 1850s. The technique evolved as others adapted it. Some hunters modified the fletching angle, creating faster or slower spin rates for different purposes. Some experimented with four-feather designs that produced more aggressive rotation. A few innovative bowyers developed asymmetric limb designs that complemented spiral-fletched arrows even better than Silas's original symmetrical bows. The core principle remained constant, but the implementation diversified. During the 1850s and 60s, abandoned mountain man camps throughout the Rockies contained arrows with spiral fletching. Settlers discovering these camps recognized the superior construction and often adopted the technique themselves. Some arrows ended up in personal collections. A few made their way to museums as examples of frontier craftsmanship. Historical research later revealed that spin-stabilized arrows were not a new invention. Various cultures had discovered the principle independently across centuries. Some indigenous peoples in North America used spiral fletching long before European contact. Asian bowyers had employed similar techniques for different purposes. What Silas had done was not invent something entirely new, but rather rediscover ancient wisdom and adapt it specifically for frontier conditions and materials. Silas Garrett died in 1869 at age 63. He was buried in a small cemetery outside his ranch property, his grave marked with a simple stone bearing his name and dates. The stone made no mention of arrows or innovation or lives saved through better engineering, but in the mountains where he had lived and nearly died, his legacy persisted in physical form. Cabins, built by later settlers, contained bundles of spiral-fletched arrows stored in corners. Journals kept by trappers and hunters included references to storm arrows or Garrett-style fletching. Trading post ledgers showed purchases of materials specifically for spiral-fletched construction continuing into the 1870s. The impossible had become routine. A mountain man had proven that wind was not an unsolvable obstacle, but an engineering problem with practical solutions. His answer, carved into feathers and wood, outlasted the man himself and changed how people survived in one of the harshest environments on the American frontier.